Well, good morning and welcome to the Christ Central Morning Devotional. I'm Alistair Semple and we're in our Christmas series and looking at the various different Old Testament prophecies of the coming of the Messiah, whose birth we celebrate, Jesus, at Christmas. So I'm just going to give us our reading for the day, which is from Jeremiah, which says this, Jeremiah 31. The days are coming, declares the Lord, through Jeremiah, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and I will remember their sins no more. So the amazing thing in Jeremiah, where we're hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus, where the nation of Israel has already had a really, really checkered history, where the people's, their story sort of starts with Abraham, but quickly transfers down to Egypt, where they live for about 400 years and from where the Exodus has to happen. And by the time they've been in Egypt, they have, as well as having a bad experience of slavery from which they're rescued, they have kind of had a real experience of prosperity. They've grown in number and they're quite self-satisfied. And they're quite connected to the gods of Egypt as well by this time. They spend 40 years in the desert because actually they don't trust God. When they get to the border of the promised land on their initial journey from Egypt to the promised land, they just said, you know, we don't fancy it. We don't trust God. And so God allows a whole generation of adults to die in the desert. It takes them 40 years. And you kind of hope that that would be a very purifying experience for the nation. And yet all of the idols of the gods of Israel that they carried out of gods of Egypt that they carried out of Egypt, seem to travel through the desert for 40 years and come with them into the promised land. So that at the end of Joshua's book, where Joshua says, choose this day who you will serve. As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. They all say, yes, yes, we will. And he then says to them, so get rid of the idols. Which they say, yes, yes. And actually, we find in Judges, which is the next book after, that's still an issue. And so a king finally comes, Saul, because the other nations have kings and they want kings. And Saul looks great, but his heart isn't in the right place. And so the story of David comes up, who is a man that the New Testament declares as being a man after God's own heart. And yet he too is flawed. His son, not his first son, but the son of his beloved wife, Bathsheba, who he had to kill the husband of so that he could take her. She gives birth to Solomon. Solomon is then the great king, the golden age, literally the golden age. But he's a flawed character. And from then after, the kingdom separates into north and south and squabbles. And kings, all of them good and bad, and some are just bad and few are good, all are flawed. And so we're at the point where Jerusalem is this big city. It has a temple worthy of the name. And the powers that have been problems at different points in Israel's history, which they've had to turn over to, whether it was the Egyptians or the Philistines, so the Philistines never took Jerusalem, and now these, the Babylonians, But in Jerusalem, which is a kind of out of the way place and kind of not worth taking because it itself isn't a really valuable city, does actually overlook trade routes, and so it's valuable for that reason. Their city kind of is a backwater, but the Babylonians decide it's just too much of a pain in the side. And the Israelites think, well, God won't allow it to fall. And Jeremiah's there saying, yes, 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 he will. And in fact, the sad thing of Jeremiah is he prophesies the complete destruction of the city, the complete removal of the people. He prophesies the exile. He is the prophet of the exile. And when finally he's told to write all the words, all the bad words, all the challenges, all the stuff that Israel's been resisting, even just on his watch as the prophet, and gives it to the king, or at least gives it to the king via some of the king's servants. The king looks at it, says, I don't like this, and he burns it. And so Jeremiah's told to write another one. Well, the story ends with Jeremiah being proved right, the Babylonians coming, the Babylonians taking people away, the best, the cream of the crop, taking them off to Babylon, which is where Jeremiah wants to go. But actually he's rescued by friends he doesn't want to be rescued by and taken to Egypt. So the book finishes with the disaster of the people who were taken out of Egypt, who came through the Exodus and who were given the kingdom, who were in the promised land and who'd seen a measure of success and had ups and downs with God all the way along the way. They've reached the low point and their city is destroyed and they're taken into exile. It is a good 400 years or so before the birth of Jesus. So here is the prophet prophesying wonderful future. When there's nothing wonderful that you can see in the history of Israel that gives you any idea that they should have any sort of wonderful future, apart from they're called by God. And he says, I will forgive their sins. I will write my law in their minds and on their hearts. That's what's coming. Now, when we come to the birth of Jesus, actually we start to see that really begin to unfold. And we are the inheritors of that. And yet, even now, when we look at this prophecy, we can tell that it is not complete. This is a covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, they will be my people. I think we could say yes, yes. Much of that has happened. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me. Well, I'm not sure we could say that's there fully yet. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. So we're in an in-between place, people. In between part of that prophecy working its way through, and yet not fully realized until we reach glory, until we see Jesus face to face, until he comes again. We're in this in-between place. What do we learn from Jeremiah the prophet, who lived in an in-between place, surrounded by a corrupted world? He had hope for tomorrow. It wasn't hope for his own life, necessarily, though he may have had reasons for that, though it didn't end the way that he hoped it would. No, it's hope for a bigger tomorrow, hope for God's plan working, hope that the real good is still yet to come. And that's got to be the sort of hope that we have, that we hold, and that we hand on. And this morning, I just encourage us as we come to prayer, think about the hope you have. Think about how you can hold on to it in dark times, and think about how at Christmas you can hand it on.